This is week 187 of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I'm Anna Belokur, reporting to you from Kyiv, and I'll be taking you through the top stories from Ukraine this week. There have been a lot of moving pieces on the diplomatic stage this week, so I'll try to move as linearly through the timeline as possible. The week began with the fourth in-person meeting this year between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and US President Donald Trump, as Zelensky traveled to New York ahead of the United Nations General Assembly. The two leaders met on Monday, and their conversation yielded some surprising statements from Trump. At a press conference after the private meeting, Trump praised Ukraine's resilience, saying that Moscow's economy was crashing and that Kyiv is doing a very good job of stopping this very large army. When asked by attending journalists whether NATO allies should shoot down Russian aircraft that violate the alliance's airspace, a phenomenon that has become all too common amid escalating tensions, Trump delivered a startlingly straightforward reply.
Any questions?
Mr. President, do you think that NATO countries should shoot down Russian aircraft if they enter their airspace?
Yes, I do.
That yes, he does support shooting down Russian aircraft in NATO airspace. His words were met with glee in countries along NATO's eastern flank, who have experienced the most provocations from Russia. Estonia's foreign minister told the Kyiv Independent that they're prepared to carry out Trump's words, should an incursion, like the one on September 19th, in which 3 Russian fighter jets violated Estonian airspace for 12 minutes, occur again. The EU's Kaja Kallas called Trump's remarks very strong statements that we haven't heard before, while French President Emmanuel Macron described them as very correct. While there's obviously a big difference between saying that NATO has the right to engage Russia in its airspace and actually doing so, this statement by the US president contrasts sharply with the ambiguity and waffling of the past few weeks, as NATO has struggled to articulate its policy and protocol in the face of escalating Russian incursions into its territory. Just this week, on Thursday, 2 Russian fighter jets were spotted near Alaska, and 5 over the Baltic Sea, and unidentified drones have caused airport closures as far west as Denmark. As well as addressing reporters after his meeting with Zelensky, Trump took to Truth Social and wrote that Ukraine is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. Well, this marks a stunning departure from Trump and his administration's long-standing rhetoric that Ukraine must be prepared to cede some of its territory in order to achieve peace, and that it's just not realistic to regain occupied territory from Russia. This reframes the end of the war as Ukrainian victory and Russian defeat, rather than capitulation or compromise. Zelensky, like many of us, welcomed this shift in tone. At the press conference, he told reporters that Trump now trusts him much more, attributing the change to apparent revelations that Russian President Vladimir Putin had lied to Trump about the actual reality on the battlefield. On Wednesday, Vice President J.D. Vance said once again that Trump is impatient with Moscow's refusal to end the war or sit at the negotiating table. So how did Russia, with its long and varied relationship with Trump, respond to his change in tune? Well, relatively dismissively. From the Kremlin spokesperson to former President Dmitry Medvedev to lawmakers in the Duma, comments followed a theme: that Trump was delusional, irrelevant, and inconsistent enough in his views that nothing he says can be taken at face value. One state TV presenter said that Trump had been fooled by Ukraine and its European allies and employed a homophobic slur. The uniform dismissal of Trump's words and refusal by public figures to engage with their meaning indicates that the Kremlin is likely rattled and working on its narrative before proceeding. On Thursday, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that NATO and the EU have declared war on Russia via Ukraine. While it's tempting to read Trump's words as an assurance that America is ready to do whatever it takes to facilitate Ukrainian victory, there is another interpretation being voiced. On Thursday, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk warned that Trump's seemingly newfound zeal could be a tacit signal that America is stepping back further from the peace process. That is to say, giving Europe permission to do what it needs to defend itself, and removing America from the equation as much as possible. This would be much more in line with Trump and his administration's insistence that Europe must take on the bulk of responsibility for Ukraine and the continent's wider security. But that's still a challenge that Europe is only slowly coming to terms with. As I mentioned, Zelensky was in New York this week ahead of the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, which played out against this backdrop of escalating tensions. Zelensky addressed the assembly on Wednesday in a speech that began with, "No one can feel safe." He cataloged breaches of airspace by Russian drones and jets, warning that Russia's war could metastasize into a global crisis, and insisting that the time to act decisively is now, with the grim sentiment that stopping Russia now is cheaper than wondering who will be the first to create a simple drone carrying a nuclear warhead. Zelensky drew attention to the fragility of international institutions, urging that alliances and armaments, rather than words, would determine whose security prevails. He also addressed the growing tide of Russian influence in Moldova, urging the EU to supply funds, energy support, and political backing to stabilize the region before Moscow can deepen its sway there, in the way it's done in countries like Belarus. Moldova happens to be holding its parliamentary elections today, and Russia's propaganda machine has been working at full speed in an effort to sway the vote in its favor. As well as speaking with Trump and delivering his address, Zelensky also met with top European and NATO officials to discuss defense priorities, sanctions, and the potential use of frozen Russian assets. There aren't really any breakthroughs from these meetings to discuss, but they indicate awareness on the part of Ukraine's leadership that defense is an iterative process. Funding fatigue, political shifts, and strategic recalibrations all loom. And as Europe questions whether and how it can defend itself in the future, the question of how best to defend Ukraine in the present hangs in the balance. As European airports divert flights due to drone threats and Russian planes violate Baltic airspace, Europe is exceptionally vulnerable to rifts and disagreement between its member states, meaning that diplomatic events like the General Assembly become less about policy and more an opportunity for allies to present a united front. So in that regard, the week was as successful as we could hope for, although as Zelensky said, words of solidarity mean far less than decisive action. The Kyiv Independent is a reader-funded news outlet, meaning that shows like this are only made possible by viewers like you. If you'd like to join our community of more than 20,000 members, there will be a link to our membership page in the description below. I'd also like to thank everyone who donates directly via YouTube. Your support is greatly appreciated. After being banned from one of the largest televised competitions in the world, Russia has sought to revive a Soviet-era version of the event. And the results are about what you'd expect. Some quick context. The Eurovision Song Contest has been broadcast on public television annually since 1956. And the premise is that each participating country enters one original song, the songs are performed on live TV, and viewers call in to vote for their favorite. Although there's also a jury and there's always a lot of drama and debate about who wins. So every year, it's viewed by millions around the world, and the competition bills itself as anti-political. Song lyrics can't be overtly ideological, everything has to be appropriate for television, and the yearly theme is always some variation of peace and unity through music. Russia has always had a somewhat awkward relationship with Eurovision. The competition began while the Soviet Union was still in the early Khrushchev years, and initially consisted of only 7 countries: Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. Soviet countries didn't participate, but in 1965, 9 years after the first Eurovision was held, the unifying broadcaster of the Eastern Bloc tried to organize a similar contest, dubbed the Intervision Song Contest. This competition was held in Czechoslovakia for several years before it petered out, but it was revived again in Poland in 1977. before petering out again in 1980. Newly independent Russia began participating in actual Eurovision in 1994 and even won in 2008. But their participation was always tinged by controversy and by a rivalry with Ukraine, who joined the competition in 2003 and has won 3 times since. In 2007, Ukrainian act Verka Serduchka came in second place with a song whose chorus repeated the nonsense phrase Lasha Tumbai, which when sung enough times in a row sounds an awful lot like Russia goodbye. Some argued that this was in violation of the competition's no politics rule, although it was ultimately deemed too ambiguous to say. In 2014, just months after Russia's invasion of Crimea and eastern Ukraine, Russia's act was booed heavily by the live audience in that year's host country, Austria. 2 years later, Ukraine won the competition with singer Yamala's song 1944 about the mass deportation of Crimean Tatars by Soviet authorities. So all of that is to say, Russia has a checkered history with Eurovision. They've been enthusiastic participants and strong disavowers. But now, they don't really have a choice. Following the 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia was banned outright from the competition. And 3 years later, re-enter Intervision. Last weekend, acts from 23 countries, including China, India, Vietnam, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, gathered in Moscow for the first Intervision in a long time. America was supposed to send a contestant, but that act backed out due to unspecified personal issues. Vietnam won the competition, which emphasized that participants should promote traditional, universal, spiritual, and moral values. Like I said, Eurovision preaches peace and love, but in a definitively liberal sense. It's always been an event where participants are afforded freedom of expression, and boundaries can be pushed in the name of spectacle. Intervision, on the other hand, carries a distinctly conservative atmosphere, not likely to inspire jealousy among the Europeans that Russia is shunning. There's always been a disconnect between Russia's condemnation of Western culture and its attempts to emulate it. Its desire to fit in on the global stage while distinguishing itself as fundamentally different from everyone else. From a domestic standpoint, Eurovision never quite worked for Russia. They poured millions into lavish acts designed to perform well in the 2000s, but also opened themselves up to both international criticism and domestic contempt from Russians who saw the competition as overly progressive. However long this revival of Intervision lasts, no one is worried that it'll outpace the beloved institution of Eurovision. But if next year an American participant really does compete, something that's never happened in Eurovision, well, then we'll have something to talk about.
Hello, this is Francis Farrell bringing you the answer to our members' question of the week. This week it was from Karen, and she was asking, how long do you think Trump's positive change in his attitude towards Ukraine will last? It's a tough question. But I want to point out one important thing, that yes, his attitude seems more positive. He seems to be saying nicer things about Ukraine. And it was a diplomatic victory in New York for Ukraine, for sure. But this positive attitude doesn't mean anything unless it's actually backed by action, by clear, hard steps to put pressure on Moscow for continuing their war and snubbing Trump's attempts to make peace. Unfortunately, we don't see that action, and instead we just have these words. And to be honest, here from Ukraine, especially from eastern Ukraine where I am right now, it just feels like he's kind of trolling at this point, giving out thoughts and prayers, saying you're doing a good job, but otherwise not really keen to do any more. You solve it, Europe, you solve it, and that's about it. More or less stepping away.
That's all for this week. We'll be back next Sunday with more news from Ukraine. If you enjoyed this video, as much as anyone can enjoy news about war and other disturbing events, please consider becoming a member of the Kyiv Independent community. It's thanks to viewers like you that we can do this work, and we're so grateful for your support. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.